Okay, welcome everybody to the 111th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. We are very pleased to have Johannes Kasinger from the Goethe University Frankfurt presenting today. In a few moments, he will get going with his presentation. Before he goes, I just wanted to flag up a couple of the announcements that I put in the reminder this morning about physical conferences taking place in person over the next few months. So on the 13th and 14th of December, so just before Christmas, just as the World Cup semi-finals are taking place, we're going to have the second Reading Football Economics Workshop in Reading. So if you do want to come to Reading in person, it is a nice place. It's close to Heathrow Airport, so it's very convenient as well. Please do look that up. I will put in the chat the link to submit a paper and for the conference website. And if you want to check your invitation for today's event, you'll be able to find that information there as well. A couple more longer term dates to mention. Our next conference is in 2023. We have on April the 21st and 22nd. It's going to be the 9th Western Football and Finance Conference at the University of Paderborn that Bernd Frick is organising. On May the 5th and the 6th, there's going to be the 17th Gijón Conference on Sports Economics that Placido Rodriguez will be organising, as always, and the topic will be women in sport. And then the 26th, 28th of June 2023 is going to be the Math Sport International Conference, the 10th conference, and that will be in Budapest. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that's going to be at the same time as the Europa League final, should that be of interest. And then finally, longer term still, August the 21st and 25th will be the 14th ESEA, European Sports Economic Association Conference in Cork, Ireland. So all those dates for your diary. I'll put some links in the chat as we get going. But I don't want to hold up Johannes any longer than I already have. Johannes, please do take away your talk on shrouding and the pass-through of sin taxes in online betting markets.
Perfect. Thank you so much, James, for having me and giving me this opportunity to present actually my job market paper. And in fact, it's the first time that I'm going to present it in that form. It's on the shrouding and the pass-through of sin taxes on online betting markets, as James already said. And let me start actually off quite broadly. So in general, there are like goods that can be overconsumed from a social welfare perspective. I think like a quite well-known example are carbon-intensive travel or environmental harmful goods in more general, but also so-called sin goods can be overconsumed. And the reason why they can be overconsumed is that actually when deciding on consuming these goods, like at least taking a standard economic perspective now, when deciding on consuming these goods, external effects on others on society or also on future selves are not taken into account, potentially due to self-control issues or other behavioral mistakes. And actually the most common central policy tool to actually discourage such harmful overconsumption are so-called corrective taxes. I think all economists in the room will know Pigouvian taxes that aim to internalize externalities and by that increase welfare, like total welfare. The same logic actually applies to so-called sin goods like cigarettes, alcohol, and also online sports betting. So the sin tax on online sports betting is actually a typical example of such taxes. And for the effectiveness of these taxes, it's really important like how they are passed through onto consumer prices, because if they want to work and if they want to discourage consumption, then the incentive has to decrease, which decreases with increasing prices. There is quite a seminal paper by Chetty that actually shows that for these effects to work, also the salience of a tax is really important. So meaning that like how really transparent a tax or a price increase is displayed to the consumers. So if it's not really salient, then people seem to react less to taxes and to price changes in general. And in the context of corrective taxation, lower salience usually implies that the optimal tax should be higher. So when actually designing such sin taxes or Picovian taxes, something that's often overlooked by the government, but also actually by the literature, is that actually if firms pay a tax, then they not only decide like how to change base prices, but they also actually decide on how to present potential tax surcharges. So there are obviously taxes where there's no freedom in deciding like how to present these taxes, but in many examples there is, and this online sports betting tax is one particular example. And there are several examples in the IO literature actually that actually shows that firms often hide relevant price information to actually increase their profits, because the shrouding, that's how I call it in this paper, really affects like how consumers react to price changes, and that's a reason why it's actually a channel how you can actually also positively influence your profits if you shroud some disfavorable information on your prices. So as an effect of this active shrouding actually by firms, the corrective tax effect that is at the heart of these sin taxes is maybe limited because it affects the salience of these taxes. And one particular channel that I'm going to look at the paper, more on the theoretical part, I don't know if you have time for that, but I'm happy to discuss it. And if you want to have a look at the paper, you can see more on the theoretical side. I will focus more on the empirical side here. But what matters actually is also that feedback effects matter. Sorry, I see I did some mistake here. It means effect, but because it usually what the literature assumes is that this tax salience is exogenous and independent actually of firm's decision. However, if actually like the shrouding, like or the salience is actually active decision by the firm, then for example, Bayesian consumers may learn something about this price information. For example, if they shroud a tax that the implicit may imply that the offer by the firms is less attractive. So, and if that's the case, then there can be actually feedback effect of this shrouding, and there might or might not be this shrouding happening in equilibrium. So that's actually an important channel if we look at the effect of corrective taxations and shrouding to really have a theoretical model that allows for these feedback effects that is usually not done by the literature. So long introduction. So the goal of this project is, so what are the effects of corrective taxes in general when firms can actively shroud these taxes? In the empirical part, I will look at the German sports betting tax that was introduced in 2012. There was actually a sports betting tax before, and I think that's maybe something interesting to most of you in the audience. And I'm really happy and looking forward to hear something that like how is the regulation and taxation of online sports betting happening in other countries, because there my knowledge is still a little bit limited. So what happened in the German case, there was in principle a higher tax rate before, but it only applied to sports bets that were organized within Germany, which is still like a leftover from the usually very local betting markets that you usually have also in the other countries. That was mainly tailored to horse racing, and like organization of a bet really means that the bookmaker is basically operating from Germany. And so by simply operating from a more liberal jurisdiction, like Malta or Gibraltar, which is usually the case, for international agencies, they just basically circumvented first the regulation, but also like all the taxes that apply to sports betting. And in 2012, the German government actually expanded the scope of the taxation also to better. So this implies that actually all sports betting that is done by German customers were subject to this tax. So, and effectively that really increased that all betting turnovers generated by German customers were now subject to this 5% tax. And before and after this reform, there was actually no other effective taxation on online sports betting. So that allows for quite clean identification. What I use is a web scrape fixed odds data from 68 international online betting agencies for more than 80,000 events between January 2009 and 2018, which allows me to estimate the effect in a difference setting, comparing price changes outside the German market with changes in the German market. We will speak later about that, like how I try to disentangle this treatment and control group. And this empirical part to really help to explain also the policy implications and to really like learn more about the potential mechanism behind the results. I also have a theoretical model that I will only like start with a little bit, so everyone has like a little bit idea in what theoretical model I'm thinking of, but it's basically an extension of the optimal syntax models, and I extend it by the competition side. So in the normal model, there's the assumption is perfect competition. In my model now, the firms compete on price and have the additional opportunity to shroud additional tax surcharges, and consumers are heterogeneous regarding the intentions towards shrouded taxes. And this implies that some consumers will react more, some consumers will react less. And in this model, we will see that actually like the shrouding behavior of firms has a really important impact on like the effectiveness of these syntaxes, which implies that actually the results, which I quickly speak of here already, have some really important implications, not only for syntaxes, but in general for corrective taxation, such as taxes on environmental harmful goods. So first of all, the theoretical model predicts active shrouding of syntaxes by firms. As I said, this implies that shrouding matters for tax effectiveness, and this in general for policy making provide an argument to regulate this shrouding behavior by firms to assure that taxes have their intended effects. For the empirical results, I find that actually betters bear the largest part of the true tax. So around prices are like 75 to 80% worse on average. I put it wrongly. It's like 75 to 80% of the 5% tax increase are passed on to consumers, so that like betting prices, which I will discuss in detail how I define that, basically as the expected return of the betting agencies per euro wagered, is around 3.75, 3.8 percentage points worse after the tax than before the tax reform. Importantly, there's a large heterogeneity in the pass-through. So agencies that don't use like such a shrouding policy are only able to shift 16% of the tax, while actually agencies that use shrouding policies that affect the difference between the advertised odds and the effective odds are able to pass on to around 90% of the tax, and this has important implications for the effectiveness of the tax. And then one little extra result, which is interesting in the context of digital taxation, is that actually the vast majority of the betting agencies that target the German market paid this tax, despite that they don't have any jurisdiction actually in Germany. So that's one often argument put forward against digital taxation. So why should actually firms that don't operate from Germany for reasons, why should then they adhere to tax rules where you don't have any power over them and really like enforceability of these tax rules? But in that case, it really seems that vast majority of betting agencies paid the tax, which is obviously important for my analysis, but which has also important implication that actually digital service taxes can work in the sense that they can generate quite some substantial tax revenue, even if the tax jurisdiction, like the tax entities, not placed in Germany. Okay, so let me just quickly talk a little bit about a usual optimal syntax model that usually studies assume, and that builds up on the PQ model of taxation that aims to internalize externalities of certain goods consumptions, like carbon-intensive travel. And here it's applied to syn goods. The the main difference between classical Pigovian tax and sin tax is actually that the costs are mainly connected to internalities. That means that they have a cost that are sometimes not internalized later. For example, future health costs due to potential problem gambling, or financial problems due to excessive gambling. And these things, at the moment when the decision maker decides to bet or not, he doesn't take into account, which means that this behavior might be not social optimal, also from the perspective of an individual. So in the model, there's like one sin good and one composite good that is basically like a numeraire, and both of these, and that's the important assumption in the basic model, are provided in a perfectly competitive market, which means that prices equal marginal costs. The consumption of the sin good is connected to costs to the future selves that are not internalized because of self-control problems or other behavioral mistakes, which is signified by CX. And the consumers, as I said, may not fully internalize the cost. And this gamma parameter that will discount the costs depending on how well future costs are taken into account. So if gamma is smaller, people are really bad in thinking about the future costs. If gamma is 1, they perfectly internalize these costs, and we're basically back to the standard model. So the motivation why it may be optimal to levy a tax similar to Pigovian tax is that actually there's a difference between the true utility and the decision utility, which yields to this suboptimal social welfare behavior. And in addition, to account for this behavior, the government can levy a per unit tax on the sin good, which finances the transfer back to the consumers. And we will see in the standard model that actually there is overconsumption of the sin good, which implies a not social optimum. The optimal behavior is clearly defined by the optimal consumption if there are no, like if gamma is equal to 1. And we see if gamma is smaller than 1, it's quite straightforward to see that there is overconsumption of the sin good, which is not socially optimal. I have to repeat myself there. And in the model, a sin tax that is equal to the externalities and internalities of this tax would implement the first best solution again. So there is actually in general in this model, it makes sense and is socially desirable to have this tax. And basically the results carry over 1-to-1 to environmental subsidies or taxes. Then one little extension that goes back to Fari and Gabay is that actually if taxes are not fully salient, then the optimal sin tax the government wants to levy and reduce is higher, because basically the effect of the tax is only partly internalized or effective for the consumption behavior, which quite straightforwardly would mean, okay, if you want to have the same corrective effect, you have to increase the tax even more so that you have the same the same desired intended effect as without salience. Well, sorry, with full salience, I have to say. So what I extend now is that these prices, which are here made in like a perfectly competitive markets, are now like a result of an imperfect competition. So that means that prices not necessarily are equal to marginal costs, but can deviate from that. In addition, the firms in the model have the possibility to use this shrouded tax surcharge, which may change the results. So just to be really quick, so in this model, now it matters like how many of the persons are really attentive to a tax and how many people are not attentive to the tax. And this really like matters like what the optimal syntax would be in this model. And there are like market segmentation where actually some firms target the naive consumers and some firms target the sophisticated consumers with like a unshrouded text in case of the sophisticated consumers, and naive consumers are targeted with worse effective prices and shrouded text surcharges. So that's the most important part of the model. So there is overconsumption, as syntax can help. If texts are not fully salient, the optimal syntax would increase. And if there is active shrouding by firms, shrouded texts imply a less strong effect of the text on behavior, and that should be taken into account in designing an optimal syntax. But now back to the maybe more interesting part for most of you, like the empirical part of my paper. So, and I think I can be really quick here. So the regulation of online betting, as in other digital markets, is really strongly lagging behind the digital reality. And I think Germany is a particular strong example here, because actually in Germany we really never had a really effective regulation until last year, where they finally started to have some regulated sports betting market. So until 21, there was really no official sports betting concession granted. And as was the case in many other countries, the betting agencies, they really operated in a tolerated gray market, where more or less agencies could really more or less freely and liberally really serve German customers by actually claiming the free movement of services in Europe to circumvent the ban of private sports betting. Before the tax, there was really effectively, because of that setup of the market, there was actually no effective taxation of online betting, and only this increase in scope of the sports betting tax that I explained earlier really imposed a new 5% duty on the betting turnovers generated by German bettors. And I think that's maybe important compared to other markets, where usually you tax the gross betting revenues, which means like the amount of money paid by the bettors minus the amount paid back to the bettors. So really it's more or less like the gross betting revenue, or like more closely like a profit before tax and some other costs. So the advantage that it's in Germany that's on betting turnovers is that it's a really substantial, first of all, and then it has a direct translation to classical syntaxes that usually are commodity taxes and excise taxes that really like taxes one good at a time. And there's no effective taxation of sports betting before and after, also applying to value-added taxes and other taxes really helps to make the empirical analysis a little bit more easy. Another background, just to put also the empirical results into perspective, and I think that's not something you hear in this audience, is that really like the betting market in Europe, they were on the rise basically since the last 20-30 years, and it's actually one of the fastest growing service sectors within the entire Europe. You see here the cross betting revenues from Germany, Italy, and France over the last 12 years. And you really see, first of all, that they more or less developed similarly, and there's more or less quadrupled or even higher in cross betting revenues across continental Europe. I know the UK, if I would plot the UK, then that's even a lot higher. And the regulation, correct me if I'm wrong, was there a lot earlier, a lot more effective, and probably also like culturally, like betting is like a little bit more common in the UK. But happy to talk about that. It's just probably my perspective from Germany, whether that's true or not. So maybe one important thing I should talk about is like how I define actually price of a sports bet. You know, like online sports betting markets, they really like served a lot to test, for example, different asset pricing theories that really looked at like how the relative prices between different bets are different. Here, I really only look at the average costs of betting, and I define this average cost of betting as basically the expected net the expected return of the bookmaker per euro wagered. So, and how do I do that? Is basically, and you know that I still repeat it even if it's not new to someone, is usually you have 3 different outcomes. Let's say we want to bet on a soccer game. We have 3 different outcomes. Every odd is like shows you, at least if we use the European decimal odds, if you would wager €1 on this event and this outcome materializes, then you would pay it out €1 times the odd on this particular outcome. I write it here as R, and usually the odd that can be decomposed in like the true probability of one event, which is unobserved also to the bookmaker, times a markup that is chosen by the bookmakers. As I said, we don't observe the actual objective probabilities to directly see like how high the markup is, but we see basically like the odds for each potential outcome, which allows basically by summing up the odds, we know that the sum of objective probabilities needs to be equal to 1, which allows us to back out the betting markup for the betting agencies. And I define the price of a bet then as using this 1 minus the inverse of these betting margins. So I define it in that way, so which means that if prices are higher, then it's more costly for the consumer to bet, just to have the direct relation to a normal price of a normal good. So if the price is higher, it's less favorable to bet, and in expectations, the consumers would lose more if the price is higher. Any questions so far? No. Okay, then I continue. So just to get an idea for people who are not familiar with betting, so usually if you get like on an agency's website, you see many different events from different leagues, and you directly see you get displayed some advertised odds. So in that case, look at the Chelsea-Manchester City match. That was when Chelsea was still probably a little bit better back in 21 compared to Manchester City. So the odds are more or less balanced, and assume now we want to bet on a draw between these 2 teams. So here we have like the decimal odds system. That means that if you bet €100 and you bet on a draw, and the odds are 3.3, this implies that you would get a payout of €330 if the game ends with a draw. So that's a little bit different to American or UK odds system, but like the translation can be used 1-to-1, and I use decimal odds here because it makes it easier to calculate the prices, and I think it's more straightforward. So if you select one of these bets, then the shrouding comes into play, because then you will have a betting slip, and the middle console is the example that we take, and but let me start off with the first example. So in the first example, we have the same odds, like 3.3, but this agency does not apply any shrouding. That means like the advertised odd of 3.3, they are also the effective odds, meaning that if you bet €100, you will get €330 back. So if there's now shrouding, and that's how I define shrouding, there's a wedge between the advertised odds and the effective odds. So in the middle panel, you see a betting slip of a shrouding agencies. Then what they do is, if you select the odds and you want to bet €100, you would also expect to get €330 back. However, they say because of the tax surcharge, we will, in case of winning, we only pay you 95% of the winnings. So that means that actually the possible payout is not 330, but it's 313.50. And basically the example 2 and 3, they're more or less similar. However, the difference is that the second agency says, okay, we only keep 5% of the winnings, which effectively is the same as the example 3, but they frame it in a way that they actually take 5% away from the effective wager. The example 3 is a little bit more favorable if you have the same advertised odds for the better, but both of them really imply that basically the entire tax surcharge is entire tax surcharge is passed on to consumers if there's no change in the advertised odds. So the data that I'm looking at to estimate the pass-through is from oddsportal.com that actually provides odd comparison tools to the users, and also have an archive of different odds of about 68 different betting agencies that I scraped from their website, and I enriched this data from different sources. So there's a Maurizio Montone paper in the journal of in the GIBO, also information on different websites, different forums, different annual reports, and different regulatory information to just get an idea on whether agencies target the German market and what shrouding policies they had in place at a particular point in time. Which is actually a little as helpful is that once they introduce the tax pass-through policy, like looking at the data and looking at the different sources, no betting agencies changed it back to a non-shrouding policy. And actually, if you go through the annual reports of these betting agencies, you really see they actively use like this shrouding, as I call it, to really pass on a lot of the tax onto consumers and keep their profits high. So in total, I have 80,000 events in 16 different leagues with many different from different sports. Here's like a list of the leagues I'm looking at. So there are 3 soccer leagues in Germany, and there's also handball, basketball, American football, and like all the major competition basically of the other leagues. In the main specification, I will focus only on soccer games. First, because it's the most common sports people in Europe bet on, and particularly in Germany. And second, because there are a lot of more basketball, American and hockey games in winter, and these are usually like 2 outcome events, which have a lower price on average. These introduces some seasonality, which doesn't change the results if I include them, but it makes a difference also when you look at parallel trends maybe before. So I focus in the main specification on soccer games, but the results are really robust if you also include handball, basketball, or American football to the league. So just some summary statistics. So the average betting price, if you look over all observations in the panel, is around a little bit more than 7%. Soccer events have a slightly higher price, which is actually in line with previous findings that the more outcomes you have per bet, the higher the markup usually is that betting agencies take. And importantly, what you see below here, so I only look at the German agencies, and I divide them depending on the shrouding policies they introduced later. And I see actually before the tax reform, like the prices of these agencies were very similar and like really didn't differ much depending on whether they introduced different shrouding policy later. And actually that's also a prediction of the model. So without taxes, we would really have a symmetric equilibrium where more or less all firms charge the same prices. And just because of the tax and the possibility to shroud tax surcharges, there might be market segmentation going on where some firms charge different prices than others and targeting different consumers. Before I really look at the pass-through rates of the sports betting tax, I just want to show you that, like as a manipulation check, maybe that in fact the tax is really effective. So people like the agencies really pay the tax, and I use data here from the H2 gambling that provided me the data for free, which was really nice, and it's really data that is used in like the betting agencies use themselves, but also regulators, and they report the total revenues in terms of onshore and offshore betting revenue. And onshore revenue, in the German case, after 2012, really refers to all revenues that are taxed, or like where betting agencies pay taxes on. And the offshore revenues refers to revenues of agencies that are registered somewhere and that target the German market, but they don't pay any taxes. I know it's still not a perfect data, but I think it's the most reliable data source that we can have, really reporting onshore and offshore betting revenues. And what really comforts me that is indeed some realistic representation is that it's really used both by public and by the betting agencies themselves to report like something like market shares and all that type of thing. But again, like completely black market betting revenues, where really they're not registered somewhere, or they're not like have a registered with some authority, they're not included here. So if you would just go to a forum and say, I give you 3.0 odds on Chelsea winning tonight, then they obviously wouldn't be reported. And these high share in like first the increase in revenues and this high share of agencies that actually pay the tax is more or less constant over time with a slightly increasing trend, really mirrors in the German betting tax revenues from like administrative tax data. And in total, I think between 2012 and 2020, like the revenues from the sports betting tax was around 2.9 billion euros. So in fact, a quite substantial number if you're interested in the tax revenues. So the identification strategy to estimate the pass-through of the tax, and with pass-through, I use the normal definition in the literature. So it's really the change in equilibrium consumer prices relative to the tax change. So a full pass-through would imply that the entire 5% of the tax change, and I don't look at local tax changes here, but at global tax changes, that may be something I should say. It's really like a full pass-through would imply that consumer prices really decreases also by this 5%, meaning that all the tax is really borne by the consumers. And I do that in a simple diff and diff setting by comparing actually changes in betting price of agencies in the German market with changes in betting prices outside the German market, which obviously is difficult to really define in such a digital setting, because most agencies, they serve several markets. I use different strategies that I will discuss later, where really I change the stringency in how I define the treatment and control group. And the nice thing about this diff and diff is if really the common trend assumption holds, then this diff and diff setting will causally identify the tax effect on prices, and also thus following the standard theory, the incidence of this betting tax. So main challenges, as I said, is really to identify a proper treatment and control group. So as a treatment group, I only consider member of the DSWV, which is basically the German Sports Betting Association. So basically the let's say as an association that really defends the public interest of betting agencies that operate in the German market. That's how they sell themselves, and they account for around 90% of all betting revenues in Germany, according to their website in 2017. And I only consider those members that were really active over the entire period. So people like agencies that join the DSV later, I exclude in the base regression, because I'm not 100% sure in what way they really serve German customers or not. So what I think that this approach really gives me a subset of agencies that really target the German market, like to really define a specific control group is a little bit more difficult because it's really hard to really say, okay, they were never serving German customers. So in the base regression, I just consider every agencies that is part of my sample, but it's not in the treatment group, or not excluded, obviously, from the sample, which is actually holds true for 3 agencies. So it's not a huge thing, not a huge number of agencies that I exclude, and results are also not sensitive to including those back in. But to make a more restrictive control group, I only consider, like in an alternative specification, agencies that have a foreign domain. So basically agencies that really assures me that. So there are agencies in that sample, for example, bwin, that have a German domain, but they also have like bwin from Italy, like bwin.it, or from Spain. And this really assures me that this is a group of agencies that do not serve customers, and they really like represent betting prices in these specific countries. And then I also use another specification where I only consider agencies that don't have a German language version, or the combination of both. Results are still very robust. As an additional corroboration that actually my results and the password rates are indeed as they are in the main specification, I exclude so-called cross leaks. So that means that I only consider German leaks in the treatment group. And the underlying assumption that I make here is that if you're German, you're more likely to bet on German events. And similarly, if you're a foreigner from a German perspective, then you're more likely to not bet on German leagues. And this effect should be stronger even for lower tier leagues. So because I really think, like judging from my own perspective, and you maybe can tell me if you have the same feeling, is that if you're talking about second division leagues in Germany, then you basically only have also German bettors in these markets. And similarly, if you have like a second division France league, you're likely to have like a huge part of French bettors, at least in the European market. Exactly. So these are the different treatment and control groups that I use. As I said, the results are really really robust to these different specifications, and they all depend on these on the parallel trend assumption, which is common in the different diff settings, which can be directly tested because we don't know like what happen in if there are no tags introduced. But I think the pre-trends here that are plotted here I just plotted the average consumer betting prices, so that the 3 years before the reform, they really looked really parallel. And also if we use more systematic tests of that I usually applied, and I use placebo testing of the regarding timing, then really can, so more or less all the tests that you can do for the parallel trend assumption looks really good. And also actually if you look at the development of prices after the reform, there is this jump, but the trend looks more or less aligned. So that at least gives me some comfort that it's really the causal effect that I'm estimating here. So first of all, for the average pass-through rate, I use just a really standard different diff setting in the first case. And I also use a standard event setting design that gives me the effect of the tax on consumer betting prices over time. So I include agency, week, and league fixed effects in the specification, and like the dummy for being in the treatment group is in the first specification T, and in the second one it's basically indicator of being K quarters relative to the tax reform and in the treatment group. So these are setup is more or less standard, I would say. And here we basically see that now the causal effect of the tax onto consumer prices, comparing changes outside the German market with changes inside the German market. And we see like more or less similar coefficient of around 0.04, which implies that actually the prices in these markets increased by 4%, which relative to the 5% increase in taxes gives us a pass rate of around 70 and 80%. Here you see like how the effects evolve over time. So before the introduction of the tax, the pre-trends, they look really, really similar. And then we see more or less strong increase directly after the tax reform, and then a slight increase in the effects over time. And like the vertical dotted line, that would signify like a full pass-through of the tax, meaning like a pass-through of 100%. So to test the heterogeneity among these shrouding policies, I used two different approaches. So first of all, the subsample analysis, where I just separate the different treated agencies into three categories depending on what shrouding policies they implemented later. And at the beginning, I really look at the no shrouding agencies, which are around which are only 2 out of 10 treated agencies that I have in the sample. Then the second shrouding policies that take the tax away from the winnings are 6, and then there are 2 more who deduct the tax from the wager. And I cut the sample of treating agencies depending on what shrouding policies they implemented later. And here it helps me that the agencies don't change the shrouding policies once they implemented one. So there are some who are later than others, but they don't change in the meantime. And now there's also the difference between the first and the second test. In the second test, I use a shrouding indicator that I interact with treatment. And this shrouding indicator is now not defined on the agency level, but on the agency game level. So if the no shroud indicator is 0, then this means that there was a shrouding policies in place for a particular game at a particular agency. So here the shrouding indicator really identifies games by betting agencies that were subject to a shrouding policy. So and in the first one, this effect might be diluted because there are some shrouding agencies that switch to shrouding policy later, but there is still treated games that were not actually subject to a shrouding policy. That's the main difference. The nice thing about the shrouding interaction is that I can also look at dynamic treatment effects. And we see here the first 2 columns give us the effect on prices for the different subsamples. So in the first one are agencies that don't use the shrouding policies at no point in time during the observation period. And there the effect is 0.08, which implies a pass-through of 16%. And if there's one of the 2 other shrouding policies in place, then we have a pass-through of 82%. And the same effect, or this large difference, is really also seen if you use the interaction specification. And the second coefficient can be interpreted as like a test whether these differences are indeed different from each other. And as expected, the difference is a little bit higher because really, like with this known shrouding adder, we really use at game agencies pairs. So there we only take really games into account that are indeed subject to a shrouding policies or not. And the difference is really around 0.041, which is around 80% difference in the pass-through rate. And here over time, we see like the games where there's a shrouding policy in place, that really more or less immediately jump after the tax reform, which really is more or less implies that actually agencies that really didn't change the tax, the underlying prices much, but basically they served the German market with a tax surcharge that basically really shifts a large part onto German customers. And then these other agencies that don't take a shrouding policies, they really take time that the prices increase. And these are also like agencies, the two agencies that really focus on the German market, that usually don't have also like a lot of other presence in other country, at least after around the tax reform. And that's also something I have to highlight. So that's more or less a personal observation, is that really like over time the competition got more intense, which really I had the feeling that they're doing more also consumer targeted policies, and also like the effects that are more far away from the tax reform might be also driven from other developments in different markets that are not directly maybe due to the tax reform. So some costs should be warranted for efficiencies that are far away from the tax reform. So let me conclude. So the active shrouding of taxes matter for the corrective and welfare effects, both empirically and theoretically. The German online sports betting tax really gives us a nice natural experiment to learn more about the effects of shrouding on corrective taxes in the digital context. Of these tax, bettors bear the largest part of the true tax burden. So really, actually, there are, in their true utility, they really seem to be worse off. However, there's a large heterogeneity depending on this tax shrouding, which implies that actually the perceived burden, which is important for the corrective effect of these taxes, that one seems to be really limited, either because prices not change much, which is true for the no shrouding policies, or because they change, but they only change because they apply shrouded tax surcharges, which are likely not be that salient, and thus don't have like this corrective effect that people want to see if they use a sin tax. And these different choices in shrouding policies really says, okay, for policy making, it really doesn't only depend like how the prices develop, but it really also means that it's important like how these prices are presented, in particular like taxes, and that actually this really provides an argument that actually policymakers should also think about regulating these shrouding policies to have the intended effects of such policies. And that's was my part. So if there are questions, if there are comments, please shoot. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Johannes. Before I even managed to say anything, Dennis's hand was straight up. So Dennis, over to you.
Thanks. This was really interesting, Johannes, and I stuck my hand up really quickly because I have another meeting at 1:30, and so I wanted to get my question in. I actually have a bunch of questions, but my bottom line takeaway is that shrouding seems to be an informational asymmetry that is exploited by some of the agencies. Yes. And over time, it seems like that informational asymmetry should go away. Mm-hmm. And when I look at your last slide, it does look like convergence, the blue, not your very last slide, but the last diagram.
But let me share it again. Sorry. This one, you mean?
Yes, I think that one. So the blue does seem to be trending towards the red. So they do seem to be converging. What's interesting to me is that it's converging towards the exploitative rather than the opposite direction.
Yeah.
That's so. I don't know if there was a question in there, but I found that really interesting, and I have to leave in just a minute. So, I'd like your reaction.
Yeah. No, that's a really important and good point. So I was also expecting learning, and I was also expecting it going from both sides. So it was something that could drive this really constant pass-through rates is, in my opinion, that we are in an environment where online betting markets really increase strongly. So like the competition pressure is not that high, which implies that actually firms can really pass through these taxes like really persistently over time. And I would be actually really curious, like how the current years where now there is an effective regulation in place changes these graphs. But that's a really good point that I probably need to discuss more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dennis. Any more questions and comments? I don't know that it matters for your context, Johannes, but because obviously your pre-trends look pretty good. But a thought was, you mentioned how your treatment group is those bookmakers in Germany who had this tax applied, and everyone else is the control group. I don't know if you're aware of any of the other regulatory changes across Europe. I mean, I know here in the UK, obviously, we tend to be a little bit different, and so here we were moving, as you mentioned, in a deregulatory direction. But often these kinds of regulatory things across the European Union, for example, tend to be quite coordinated. So I don't know if there were similar type measures put in place in other countries.
Well, that's definitely a point that I need to look in more, like really how like the regulation in other European countries changed. Which is comforting in my opinion is that if I really use like different domains, the pre-trends, they really don't change much. So even if I really shrink in a way the control group and make it more persistent, these pre-trends are also very similar. However, and that's what I was relating to, if we move further away from the tax reform, obviously the likelihood that like a large part of other countries had also regulations that affect prices, that could mean that some of the effects are driven by regulation in other countries compared to Europe. So that would harm the parallel trend assumption, which I think is definitely possible. I can't perfectly rule it out, but I agree. Like the paper would benefit if I really take a closer look and we can really say like when was the timing of other regulations in other countries and how that affected prices there.
Yeah. Any more questions and comments? Okay, well, I'll ask another one then. A fairly basic question. Your chart that we're just looking at goes to 2018.
Yeah.
Is that on purpose, or is that just the data that you collected, or do you think you only wanted to look at that window for the effect?
No, that's just basically the window that my data covers. So I started the collection quite some time ago, and there was a different position that was not directly related to research. So that's why it only goes to the end of 2018.
And did I get it right that you look at the top 3 divisions in Germany, or is it just the Bundesliga?
No, the top 3 divisions and I also used that in a robustness check later to really only look at smaller leagues, assuming that like the nation of bettors is really more connected to the actual where the actual game took place. So like in the 3rd league in Germany, I guess they're really nearly only German bettors on this European agency websites, which and also there the similarity of results really comforts me that I'm indeed measuring the effect, like comparing the German with non-German markets. That gives us a realistic representation.
Yeah. And I presume again that was the decision based on the data that you collected, because I guess there's more regional divisions below the third league. Is that correct in Germany?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had to take one decision, and I obviously did it before some results are there. So and you also see that there's some more German leagues in there, just like because I had this in mind that actually, for example, also the same holds true for handball or basketball. Of these league, there's not really, like, I think, much audience from other countries that watch these games and also bet on these games. So that I thought it's like gives me a nicer treatment group if I only consider these leagues there. But I guess that the number of leagues is sufficient to get like solid results, but sure, that can be expanded. Even if I have to say what I did, like I checked Odds Portal, like to really see whether the information that I see as a user are the same as I get on Odds Portal, which they are, at least using a German IP address, which is, I guess, the most important part. But I don't know whether they keep updating the archive or not. I think so. So I think we could expand the data set.
More questions and comments from the audience? Looks like it might be a no, which suggests that you gave a very comprehensive presentation covering all the kinds of questions that might be asked of you. I'll begin to wrap up. If anyone does have any questions and comments they still want to ask, you still got a few seconds when you can raise your hand. But what I will say is thank you, Johannes. It was a really interesting talk, a really interesting data set. Great setting as well, where you've got this control group and the treatment group and a really clear effect. That's really nice. We are going to take a break next week here in the UK. It is what's called half term, where the kids are off school. So I'm having a little break next week. And we're going to return on the 4th of November, when we're going to have Thomas Warner presenting the relationship between financial and sporting performance of professional football clubs, empirical evidence from Brazilian football. So we'll switch from having had a couple of talks from Germany to talks on Brazil in a couple of weeks' time. So I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks' time, and I wish you all a great weekend in the meantime. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Johannes.
Thanks a lot, James.